It's taken nearly 3 decades, but cars from the 1980s are finally getting their due respect. Cars like the Fox Body Mustang, IROC Camaro, Toyota Celica, and even oddballs like the Dodge Omni GLH are no longer thought of exclusively as a byproduct of the malaise-era hangover. In fact, some cars from the 1980s have become quite desirable. So that got me thinking, are there any other 1980s vehicles that have gone from Back to the Future 3 to the Breakfast Club? Since I'm on vacation, I thought I'd look at this, a 1980 Silverline Nantucket. If you've never heard of Silverline, it's probably because the company folded shortly after this boat was made, but this is a vehicle from the 1980s and is right here, so we might as well take a closer look. Cars from the 1980s had a very distinctive look with liberal applications of wings and vents and louvers. But I guess boats from the era didn't really get the same treatment because this just kind of looks like a boat. But I will say the angles in this windshield kind of look like the headlights you might find on a car from the 1980s. Matching color schemes was a hallmark of cars from the 1980s. And on that front, the Silverline doesn't disappoint. As you can see, the exterior is blue, and so are the seats and the carpet and even the dash. It kind of looks like a Smurf exploded in here. The cassette tape was the dominant music format of the 1980s, but this boat was built just a little bit too early in the decade to receive such cutting-edge technology. So under here, you'll find an 8-track player. But that's okay, because I really like ELO. Back here, the engine says Mercury, but it might as well say BMW. That's because this outboard is a straight 6 with individual carburetors. And because people from the 1980s didn't really care about polar bears yet, this is a 2-stroke. So it's actually more powerful than its 115 horsepower rating would suggest. On open water, this thing can hit 47 miles per hour, which is about the equivalent of 470 miles per hour on land. Hot hatches were coming into their own in the 1980s thanks to their combination of driving performance and practicality. And this boat is no different. It combines its 2-stroke power with storage everywhere. It's in the walls, in the dash, in the center console, under the seats. There's even a 2-bedroom apartment in the floor. But unlike cars from the 1980s, this Silverline actually has some pretty decent build quality. Okay, so admittedly the radio's just sitting on a shelf in the center console, but this thing is nearly 40 years old and still feels tight as a drum. Not a single interior trim piece has fallen off during this cruise. A lot of the appeal of a car from the 1980s is the analog driving experience, and this boat is no different. The steering is nice and heavy and direct, there's no electronic nannies getting in the way, and this engine note is just so honest. There's no artificial noise being pumped in through this 8-track player. The only thing that can make this more authentically 80s would be some neon colors and turbo badging. So there it is, the 1980 Silverline Nantucket, proof that cars weren't the only cool vehicles from the 1980s. This has most of the performance of a modern boat with some cool vintage touches that you just can't get anymore. Good luck walking into a modern boat showroom and asking for a monochromatic color scheme. So if you're in the market for a vintage 80s car, why not buy a vintage 80s boat instead? Buy a boat? What kind of advice is that? I hope no one listens to me.